Jump in here and just talk about the first year I got to NPR was '98, and that was raised last year on Talk of the Nation. And the thing that I always thought about at that time, you have to understand that I grew up with Walter Cronkite and all those wonderful older white men, and they were in our newsrooms or our homes every night. These were the voices and the faces that we saw all the time, and we trusted. And what I was so in awe of was Ray's command of the airwaves, but also the fact that this was a time to gather and to listen to his show. And I also remember how the sort of anguish that people felt when they heard he was leaving in the show. So what I hope we'll get from this experience is the impact, not only on Talk of the Nation, on Al Jazeera, on PBS NewsHour, that the contribution that he has made to journalism. So,
for those of you who were too young to remember when Ray started.
Don't say that.
Listen, before you came, I just confessed that we have 9 decades of journalism experience among us all, so we're outed. But Ray has had a really amazing 30-plus year career in broadcast journalism. He was raised in Brooklyn. He was an Eagle Scout. He's the author of 3 books, I believe. Is that up to date, Ray?
Yes. Okay. 4th one will come out at the end of 2023. You are all commanded to buy it.
And he was, as all of you probably do remember, PBS NewsHour correspondent until 2013. He's now a U.S. correspondent for Euronews, and you can find all of his other accomplishments on the website and through your agendas. But I'd also like to mention that Ray has uplifted so many other people along the way. And it's in that spirit that I'm really honored to welcome you here.
No, thank you.
And I'll turn it over to you.
Great.
Please welcome Ray Suarez.
Well, great to see you all, and I think it's revealing the ratio of men to women in this room, which is very much part of the modern business and not part of the business that I started to grow up in. In the book of Ecclesiastes, in the Hebrew Bible, there's a famous declaration that is often rendered in more modern and in newsrooms saltier language by reporters. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. In the business, people will sometimes note that they've done a certain kind of story 100 times. And that all that was different was the place or the name of the people involved, but that the story is pretty much the same. For those of you who do local news, this is certainly the warehouse fire on a Saturday night, where you have to do a live shot. I thought about that old cliche last fall, when the findings of a new report on Latinos in newsrooms and in Hollywood was presented by Representative Joaquin Castro for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. The findings, this will shock you to hear, was that Latinos are nearly invisible in newsrooms, and that the creative output of TV and the movies renders 18.7% of the country, more than 62 million people, absent from the culture, makes them very simply not key players in the stories America tells itself about itself. And not working as the people telling those stories creates problems with representation, perennial misunderstandings about who that enormous group of people really is. In an interview with the AP, Congressman Castro said, "None of this has been an effort to tell people exactly what to write, but to encourage that media institutions reflect the face of America. Because then we believe that the stories will be more accurate and more reflective of truth and less stereotypical. American media, including print journalism, has relied on stereotypes of Latinos. If the goal is the truth, well, that certainly has not served the truth." The business, and I refer to it that way on purpose. It is a business, has transformed beyond all recognition since the first time I walked into a newsroom and got paid for being there in 1976. I went to work as a desk assistant at WNEW Radio. It was a property of a company called Metro Media, which owned radio and television stations in big American markets. I maintained the wire service machines as they clacked out copy hour after hour, changing the spools of paper that fed those machines, changing the ink-soaked ribbons that kept stories showing up on paper as they came from Associated Press, United Press International, and Reuters. It was, most of the time, and as you climb the job descriptions, it got even more so, an almost entirely white, disproportionately male workforce, which was true of the news business overall back then. Joining me in making the princely sum of $2.20 an hour was one black desk assistant and one other Puerto Rican. All three of us went on to have careers in the business: Ramon Plaza in sports television, Lidge Lewis in radio news, me doing a wide variety of things, and now asked to look back on 45 years for you here today. One thing I want you to all consider as I tell you about one person's career is the breakneck rate of change. In many, many ways, that 1976 newsroom had more in common with a 1946 or 1956 newsroom than it does with the newsroom of today. Technological change, change in the regulatory environment, the engineering of money, how rich people amass the capital to acquire media properties, all of that has absolutely and utterly, completely transformed. And the change in the product. WNEW does not exist anymore. And when I worked there in the 1970s, it was arguably one of America's great radio stations. It was one of the pioneers of a format called MOR, literally middle-of-the-road radio. It was programmed for listeners from 25 to 65 years old. Is there any media product in any medium which is understood to be programmed for Americans between 25 and 65 years old? No, what we've seen is the rise in niche media, searching for thin slices of the audience that can then be delivered to advertisers with more efficiency. The concentration of ownership in fewer and fewer hands. There's a million different causes for this transformation that's happened since I started. There's not a single cause. And while all this change took place in the industry that explained the world to readers, viewers, and listeners, the audience itself changed drastically, too. The world I grew up in and went to work in was a post-war world with a declining number of foreign-born Americans. Overwhelmingly white, in a social order created by the decades of the U.S. world dominance after the Second World War. By the early 60s, a dwindling number of Americans had been born in another country. And the U.S. had, since the 20s, a legal framework for immigration based on a quota system put in place in the 20s that assured that America would remain a white majority country forever. That was the purpose of the 1920s rewrite of America's immigration formulas. The culture that spoke to America in the 1960s when I was growing up, the 1970s when I went to work, was remarkably white. When you watched a situation comedy or a drama set in an American city, as many shows were set in American cities in those days, or in the rural or small town South, that seemed to be the dichotomy. All the shows either took place in Los Angeles, New York, or Petticoat Junction, or Mount Ivy, where Andy Sheriff Andy and Opie were walking around. Every single character, literally every single character in the show, the drivers of the story, all the incidental characters were all white. Even then, it was a strange view of the country. It wasn't accurate then, but it would be bizarre now. ABC, a network spun off from giant NBC decades earlier, was the third of the three networks. Always the perennial straggler. Eventually decided to do something risky and different, unveiling TV dramas meant to be grittier, more realistic, which was, in those days, what was gritty and realistic. TV shows that had black people in them. We understand the framing in dramas to be essentially focused on problems. That's what a drama is. It's a comedy with a problem. So the new realism of these new shows inevitably centered on crime and punishment, schools, housing integration. So black people implicitly became problem people. But this didn't just happen on entertainment television. It happened in the news as well. As the frame for telling America's story became, because of the social drama playing out on the streets of America, the problematizing of non-white people. And that framing gave us a different kind of mirror to hold up to the country during that part of the day that was devoted to news. Even though the battles fought over civil rights were really white people problems. I mean, if you pass a law that says nobody can live here but white people, that's a white people problem. If you fight over laws about who gets to go to what school and who decides who's the principal and who's the superintendent of the local school system, that it can't just be white people anymore is a white people problem. But what happened with the framing of the way we told those stories during that era? White people unwilling, forced by law to share political power, share access to institutions, share access to advancement, share living space. The narrative frame was one of an other people problem. So the problem people model was broadened during the entire Lyndon Johnson era Great Society programs of urban unrest, the wrestling matches over school integration and housing. When American cities burst into anger and flame, the careers of many black journalists began right at that moment. Why? Because they were dying to be newspaper journalists? In some cases, yes, and we'll get to that. But in many newspapers around the country, a news director, an editor, would look out at the sea of desks and look out at his entire staff and see what? Just white men. And when U Street is on fire, or Euclid Avenue is on fire, or Lenox Avenue is on fire, or Roosevelt Road on the south side of Chicago is on fire, and you don't have a single black reporter, you tell one of your white reporters to go down to production or sales or distribution and look for a black guy in a tie, because he's likely to be a black guy who's finished high school or college. You hand him a notebook and he goes out with you to Euclid Avenue or Roosevelt Road or U Street. So if you talked to old heads in the 80s and the 90s, they'll tell you they got their start when America's cities were ablaze. And then, realizing that they couldn't go forward from that moment with all-white newsrooms, they then looked to the Pittsburgh Couriers and the Amsterdam Newses and the Chicago Daily Defenders and started to hire experienced journalists from those institutions to work for the Sun-Times and the Tribune and the Plain Dealer and the Daily News and the New York Times and on and on. These were the two big pathways into careers which had simply been closed to people before that. For readers, listeners, and viewers, the portrait of America was only at the earliest moments of change. In 1965, with the approval of President Johnson, we trashed, finally, that 1920s quota system and opened the country to immigrants from Africa, Asia, and Latin America at scale. And before long, labor hunger and opportunity search combined to create a new country. A new country that's represented by the, 60 of you or so sitting here. A country that would have been impossible when kids were sitting with Daniel Boone hats on, watching black and white television, and a bizarre all-white America that came to them courtesy of Disney and other big content creators. New audiences came to the television in the 70s, 80s, and 90s with new expectations about what news was and who should tell the stories. And the arguments about representation and about who's who in the media workforce haven't changed all that much in 45 years. Creating a workforce more roughly representative of America shouldn't be hard, but it is hard because this is a shrinking business. Fewer people make a full-time living as a journalist in the United States than did at the turn of the century, 22 years ago. And that should scare the crap out of all of you. I mean, if there's one thing you remember from everything I tell you today, that should be the one thing you remember. Thousands of journalists have lost their jobs in the intervening 22 years, even though the amount of content has increased enormously. Well, you do the math. What does that mean? It means fewer people doing more stuff every day. That means more people working to make part of their living feeding the many beasts of TV, podcast, radio, and the web, while fewer people make a full-time living at it, meaning have jobs that also have health care and a pension plan. That kind of stuff. All kinds of content that simply wouldn't have been considered news once upon a time isn't journalism, really. It doesn't conform to the traditions, the folkways, the forms of ferreting out facts and ideas, turning it into a story that I learned on the way in, on the front door, now live under that far more amorphous umbrella. Not news, but media. Not news, but content. Is One America News journalism? Is Newsmax journalism? Is Breitbart journalism? Is just talking to people about a topic and putting it up as a podcast journalism? Yes, and often no. And I guess it depends. Has to be the answer that we end up with. I am less sure than Representative Castro says he is, that this is a fixable problem, or at least can be fixed by increasing minority employment. That's not a one-size-fits-all solution to the scale of the problem. Beats and specialties are luxuries a lot of news organizations simply can no longer afford. And when you have a workforce that's put to work understanding the country so that we then turn around and explain it to the country, the lack of beats and specialties, the lack of being able to focus on one part of our national life in a country that's getting more complex and more difficult to cover every day, that's a recipe for some real problems. And some of those problems showed up during the coverage of the pandemic, when you had people who clearly had never covered public health before, never been to the CDC before, never interviewed an epidemiologist before, doing this stuff on the fly and trying to master some really difficult material that was now in their brief suddenly, and then turn right around and hit their deadlines. Also, we are now trapped in this form where you go and go out with your notepad or a microphone or a camera and just stick it in somebody's face. They tell you something, and we turn that into material. It may be true, it may be a lie, it may be delusional, it may be absolutely fanciful, but we will dutifully record it and then turn it around. I don't have the answer for that problem because that's a problem that's not created by us not understanding our job. It's created by reporters who now have to file 3 times a day instead of once a day, who don't get to backstop some of the material that they're asked to gather. Is the imprecision a function of a lack of representation or a function of the structures that have grown up in a business where reliable sources of income for media properties are no longer reliable? Staffs are stretched to the limit. Some of the deep questions about representation and employment collide head-on with who we practitioners think we are. I've covered stories on 5 continents. We reporters think, drop me in by parachute to anywhere and I can cover anything because I'm a reporter. So I should be able to do that. That's part of the way we pat ourselves on the back and bump ourselves on the chest. We're those people. We go to unfamiliar places, talk to people we don't know about things we've never known before, try to turn it into a coherent story that we can then turn around and tell to somebody else. That's not our shame, that's our pride. I've reported from Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa, even though I'm not an African, perhaps deceiving myself that I get more than I really do because I could communicate with people around me. I've also covered stories in Mexico, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Peru, but I'm not any of those things either. Reporters find it a little insulting when it's suggested that there's something they can't cover. We, by nature, think we can cover anything. And that ends up being a weird kind of trap for minority reporters, too, as their assignments in some newsrooms, for all too many cases, end up getting confined to, let's call them, contextual ghettos. You might, in principle, endorse the notion that an LA newsroom should have a couple of Mexican Americans in it. I think if I went and polled you all, you'd, in general principle, say, yeah, if you're a newsroom in LA, you should have some Mexicans. You might agree with the general proposition that a New York newsroom should have at least 1 or 2 Puerto Ricans or Dominicans in it. Fair enough. But when it comes time to cover UN General Assembly Week in New York, does it follow that the Puerto Rican reporter doesn't get to go to the impromptu news conference held by Boris Johnson or Joe Biden, because neither Boris Johnson nor Joe Biden are Puerto Rican? Maybe the assignment, that assignment, prestigious and high profile, and let's face it, often really interesting, should go to the same people in the newsroom that those kind of assignments always go to. I worry about that because along with being someone who's covered Latino communities in New York and LA and Chicago, I am at the same time a careerist. And I have no apologies about that. I wanted and I fought for and I headed into the scrum of the editorial meeting vying for the lead story. I wanted to do the lead story. And I wanted to speak to the whole community in a coverage area about the whole community's interests, and knew that if I allowed myself to be the immigration guy, the street gang guy, the ESL guy, I would do a good job because I'm a good reporter, but I also might find myself unable to climb the greasy pole of the newsroom because those are not the stories, generally, that get you at the top of the newscast or above the fold on the front page of tomorrow morning's newspaper. Those are not, in most newsrooms, the stories that zoom you to the attention of the top people in your organization. Must ESL and immigration and gang crime be covered? Absolutely. Must I always be the one, it's assumed, who will cover those things? Let me get back to you on that. It may be true that the breezes blowing through today's newsrooms are a little different, and those worries might be a little less present, but not for a good reason, but in part because veteran status and experience are less valued than they've ever been before. So it's not the bottom being able to rise to the top, but it's the flattening of the top down that's creating something like the morning shape-up on the docks on the waterfront. Completely ridiculous dated reference as I look around the room. Who's seen On the Waterfront? Okay. It's about corruption. It's about corruption in the dock unions. It's about corruption in the dock unions in 1950s New York. And the opening scene is of all these longshoremen coming for the shape-up. They come to the gates at the dock in the morning. There's a load that has to be taken off this cargo ship that's just come into New York Harbor. And a guy who's sort of the bridge between the working guys and management comes out and basically taps people on the shoulder. You get to work, you get to work, you get to work, you get to work. The rest of you, come back tomorrow. And one of my favorite movies. You really should see it. But when I watched that and watched the shrinking workforces in a lot of the places where I've worked over the years, I thought about the morning shape-up and the rise in contingent labor in the news business and thought, how far away are we really from the day when some middle management person will be able to say, okay, you work today, you work today, you work today, the rest of you come back tomorrow. That world is a scary world. Young, nervy, elbows out, trying to get ahead people, they think of that as an exciting world because they think, oh, I'll be okay, because they'll pick me. But over the long haul of a career, your cunning and your wits and experience may not be as valued when you're in your 40s, and it will be the new version of yourself that's standing there on the dock who thinks, this is okay, because I'm going to be the one who's going to get picked. Again, I don't want to scare you too bad, but this is kind of where things are going. The rise in contingent labor is a really big part of how some of the most read websites get on, how some of the most seen video gets screened and streamed, how some of the most heard podcasts are created. At the same time, the traditional arm's-length neutral voice affected by news organizations large and small across the country is being re-examined right at this moment. And right along with the old notions of objectivity and distance, also valued is this new thing, a unique and authentic voice, the ability, even the willingness, to speak up for the interests of one or another community in your coverage area. And again, in theory, it sounds great, and then in practice, you think, I don't know, how do we do that? How far do we get from some of those old hidebound, tame traditions of storytelling, where you would read a story and you didn't have to see the byline, because what difference would it make who the byline was? They would follow the forms of American journalism, and you wouldn't know what this person feels about a political party, a candidate, a neighborhood, an issue. There was an idea that doing that kind of reporting was actually a risk for your career. If you got known as someone who injected your opinion into your reporting, who slanted stories, who didn't quote people that you thought were not on the right side of an issue, that would actually harm your career. Now that's kind of being renegotiated. And as an aside, I'll mention that this creates a problem for someone like me, who had to ferociously code switch, get the Brooklyn streets out of my on-air self in order to be able to rise in the 80s and 90s, to play the game under the rules that existed then as I was trying to play it, and find out now in my 60s that the rules have changed, making that deracinated self less valued by a business that suddenly wants some OG urban primitive, original ethnic ghetto me that they wouldn't have wanted when I was a kid. So you're kind of caught between two stools when the music stops. Today's upper Northwest DC me, not as highly desired. So Maria Hinojosa, an old friend, has been able to present herself not only as someone who can credibly and effectively cover immigration in a knowledgeable way, but also positioned herself as a spokesperson for immigrant America in her journalism. A person who can channel hopes, dreams, and fears in a way that doesn't jeopardize her future. This is, I think, an interesting development, one to be watched. I'm not sure where it all lands. It's a singular point plotted on a long timeline, but it's definitely different. She is liberated by this moment, set free to give her opinion, insight, and analysis, and then also be used as a straight reporter. That's a sign of what's going on in the business in wider ways, and a more particular sign of what minority reporters are allowed to do. The idea that you need certain people to cover certain stories is a trap. It's a syllogism with unpredictable effects and unpredictable downsides. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the exciting ways in which the reduced authority of gatekeepers has been creating opportunity. That's exciting and interesting and unpredictable. The road to speak to an audience in print, in sound, in pictures used to be such a narrow, tiny door. Even if you could make the fearsome capital expenditure of buying a TV camera in the 1980s, they cost $45,000. When I went out as a correspondent in LA for CNN in the mid-80s, I was making $45,000, and on my camera operator's shoulder was a camera that cost $45,000. It helps keep everything in perspective. You could not, even if you wanted to borrow the money and buy that camera, you couldn't put yourself on TV. No one would see you. You'd turn up at a television station and say, "Hey, I have this stuff." And they'd say, "Who are you?" Because that's the way things worked then. Stations invested heavily in their own people and were not about to have somebody who basically hired themselves show up at the front door with a video cassette under their arm and then turn around and put that person on the evening news, even if they had a good story. If you called the New York Times or the Boston Globe in 1985 and told them you had a manuscript that you wanted them to run in the next day's paper, what would they say? They wouldn't take you seriously. They'd tell you to write a letter to the editor. Short films, photojournalism, independently produced docs, the internet has made it possible for you to find your own audience, which is kind of amazing, without having to worry about being throttled or tamed or dumbed down by the monopolists with TV and radio licenses and printing presses. You can walk into a Best Buy after we get out of here, if there's still one open, and for less than $1,000, buy a camera that takes a better picture than the one that my $45,000 camera took in 1985. And it's so easy to use that you could learn how to use it before dinner. You can edit the video you shoot on it on your laptop, record and mix your own voice tracks on the same machine. This is stunning. My phone has significantly more computing power than the laptop I bought in 1997 to write my first book on. And that primitive, heavy monster with lousy battery life and almost no memory was nowhere as good as the cheaper, lighter machine I use every day, which costs 1/3 of the price. So barriers to entry for becoming a content creator are lower, are shallower. The internet is a great leveler, pushing back on the power of old media to a degree. I don't want to exaggerate it, but it is pushing back. This is an amazing development, and at the same time is part of the economic trends that leave us with more people aiming to work in the business than can possibly get jobs in it. For those of you who've even done 1 hour in an economics class on labor market theory, you know that once aspiring entrants to a marketplace outnumber the amount of slots in that marketplace, what happens to the price of labor? It declines. The price of labor is bid down by an expanding number of entrants to a marketplace without an expanding number of places for them to work. So you end up with this huge number of people creating a bewildering amount of stuff, some of it absolutely wonderful, and they can hardly pay their bills. I assume there's going to be a shakeout of some sort in the coming years, a flight to quality by the audience, killing off weak entrants into the marketplace that really will eventually have no reason to exist. And then some more equilibrium will be achieved between people trying to get in, people who can actually find something to do that somebody will pay them for. I think this is a promising time, it's an exciting time, and it is a terrifying time, all in the same moment. I have, right at the moment, too many employers, and I am my own payroll department, my own equipment manager, my own business agent, my own recording engineer, and I don't do any of those things as well as I do reporting. So I have a core job and then a bunch of other jobs that I don't do as well, and I know I don't do them as well, but I do them. It is likely I will never again have a long-term, full-time job again, even though I very much want one. This is something I never thought would happen to me, but here I am. The upside is I get to do things that interest me. Don't have to bother with things that don't, unless there's a great payday at the end, and often enough there is. But you, in all the various contexts in which you exist in news organizations, may say to yourself, I don't want to be a symbol of anything. I just want to do this job. I'm not a physical flag. I'm just me. Or you may say, I get it. Whether I want to be or not, I'm going to end up being a symbol of something. To my bosses, definitely. To my colleagues, maybe. And they are, in part, going to see me in that way, whether I like it or not. What do? I mean, that's a reality. It's a reality that you have to deal with. You symbolize something just by your bodily presence, by your name on a business card, and it forces you to have some self-concept as you wade in there, whether these assignments are forced upon you or one that you happily take onto yourself. And it's not something that you can easily say, okay, I'll be a symbol on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and I'll just be me on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I had no idea how complicated all this stuff was going to be and how complicated and personal some of these questions were going to be when I left that entry-level job and tried to start climbing the ladder. Wanting, I thought, nothing more or less than to be assessed for the quality of my work and the quality of my work alone. I later moved to ABC Radio, where I did the same job, got a 10 cents an hour raise, and was the second Latino there. Network radio, biggest radio network in America, in the biggest Latino city in America at the time, 2 of us in the newsroom, at the lowest job of all, the entry-level copy boy job. The only other Latinos at ABC Radio at that time were the people who cleaned it at the end of the workday. I moved to a company that published business magazines where I was a news editor. I was the first Latino employee there in any capacity at all. Later went back to ABC Radio, where I was the first Latino to work as a producer and writer on staff, to CNN, where I was a Los Angeles correspondent and the only Latino on the air, to the NBC O&O in Chicago, where I was the first Latino staff reporter, to NPR, where I was the only Latino host of a daily news program, to the PBS NewsHour, where I was the only Latino on the air, and for much of that time, the only Latino editorial employee working in any capacity. To Al Jazeera, to unemployment. I should make it very clear that I am not bragging. That is not bragging. That I can say that bunch of places where I was the first and the only, is a tragedy. It's not anything for me to brag about, but there it is. It didn't make me particularly excited or proud to be the first, because it's a very precarious position to be in. The Black and Latino editorial employees, just after I left ABC Radio as a producer, sued the company for failure to hire and promote. And boy, oh boy, did they have a legitimate gripe. It was a big lawsuit brought by people all up and down the editorial food chain, alleging and having copious evidence of a failure to hire and promote. One of their lawyers got in touch with me, now happily employed somewhere else, and said, please join the lawsuit. And at that time, in 1985, I thought, well, if there are only 3 networks on Earth, and it seemed like there was never going to be another one, why sue 33% of all the networks in existence? Will that do me any good if I'm now 27 years old and want a long and happy career in this business? I did not join the suit. They did win. But in discovery, it turned out that one of the reasons they hired me at all was to fight the lawsuit. The lawsuit was filed on like August 7th, and I was hired on August 10th. And that made me rethink the entire time, 2.5 years that I was working at ABC, because I thought, well, if that's the only reason they hired me, I could have been great, I could have been mediocre, I could have been terrible. It didn't matter. All I was sort of lawsuit fodder. That's a very discouraging thing and a very realistic part of what makes the business tough. It was depressing often enough to be the first or the only, like being the last dodo, or the last passenger pigeon. You look around the newsroom for the other passenger pigeons, and there aren't any. The myopia of our business, the shocking conservatism and inability to see the writing on the wall, in many contexts, a guarantee that I was going to have to play a weird hybrid role. One late middle-aged Puerto Rican guy from Brooklyn standing in as an avatar for 62 million other people. And you have to know everything about them, what they want, what they think, what they like, what they don't like. Because who else are they going to ask, frankly? There is nobody else to ask. I can't tell you the number of times people would bring back wild track sound from a demo. And I'd be passing by in the newsroom and they'd say, hey, come in. And I'd come over and they'd say, what are they chanting? What are they chanting? And I'd tell them and I'd move on, and there's always that moment, like, all right, I mean, this is part of the argument that we make for why we're here, right? Because, hey, then you can turn around and say to somebody, what are they chanting? And they'll actually know. Then, at an editorial meeting, some interested person will wheel around and say, what are we missing? What are we missing? Well, how many hours you got? What are we missing? We're missing more than I can ever tell you in the course of these meetings if we spent nothing at these time at these meetings but me telling you what we're missing. It's an illustration of why I'm valuable to have around, but are my Anglo colleagues expected, required to know anything in particular? Any specific area of knowledge that makes them arguably useful to have around the newsroom? Once an Irish, Midwestern born and raised colleague made fun of me in the newsroom for stumbling when I gave a Spanish quote during a live shot, because I was translating from Spanish to English in my head, and then I restated it using the proper verb tense. And I thought, really? You're making fun of me for this? And I said, well, all right, remind me to call you the next time somebody's chanting something in Gaelic and I need to know what they're saying. Oh, that's right. You don't have to know Gaelic. You don't have to know anything. It rankles to this day that it isn't recognized how often it's assumed that we possess, walk around with the encyclopedic knowledge of other worlds, safely tucked away in our heads when no such expectation exists for so many of our colleagues. But if that expectation exists, what's the play for you? To not know stuff? That's probably not a great recipe for success, to always be the person who says, what are they chanting? Shit, I don't know. And just keep on moving. How do you as an individual respond to that expectation that you are a vessel containing specialist knowledge, there to enlighten, inform, and release horrible guilt from their shoulders? As I look back on a long life in the business, I'm at the very same instance, pleased at how much better things are for minority editorial employees than when I got started, and at the very same moment, saddened by the myopia, the tokenism, the limited opportunity horizons for so many minority journalists. Part of it comes from a knee-jerk set of reactions. What's the problem? Well, here, let's just throw this solution at the problem, thinking, this'll fix it. Let's just hire a couple of more. Always at the entry level and the front end, by the way, because Latino means young. You didn't know that, but Latino does not mean old. If you are an old Latino, you're just old. They drop the other part, or the other part is silent. I think we didn't fully take into account how much our organizations are shaped by habit, by folkways, by a sense of the ropes and the ladders that people negotiate and navigate for their rare editorial jobs. Diversifying a shrinking business is really hard. Part of it comes from a basic, essential confusion about what the news business is for and what it was ever for. Either we're really meant to hold up a mirror so America can see itself and thus be better informed and even more reliable news consumers, or living as many of us do in a commercial environment where news is just stuff to pack in between commercials, do we seek to give people comfort and reassurance as much as information, not to rock their boat, not to rock their world, not to make them feel bad about anything? Journalists, whatever their racial background or ethnic origin, are simply entertainers of a slightly more serious kind. We don't have to be as good-looking as the people who are on the actual entertainment shows, except if you're an anchor person. That's the asterisk. But we are the business, after all, that spent 5 days talking about the death of Prince and 5 minutes talking about the death of 1 million Syrians. We are that business. It's not just representation that we have to be arguing about and thinking about. It's what we do, why we do it, and who we do it for. It is no exaggeration to say some of these deep existential questions were raised again and again, and painfully, I think, during the last 2 presidential elections, even as the answers to the questions, who is an American and who gets to make the claim to be part of us, were being renegotiated right on the air, live during some of these crazy rallies. So that already existing big core set of problems was not being adequately addressed for anybody, and minority journalists had an extra set of responsibilities, an extra set of tasks that made our lives more complex, more challenging, if you wanted to take those other big questions on. We were expected to know what was going on in the barrios in a way that our fellow reporters did not. We can talk about whether that's a reasonable expectation or not. We were expected to represent our employers at cultural and neighborhood events or at national meetings, which is another set of responsibilities that does not apply to your colleagues. We were expected by activists, community groups, politicians, rank-and-file neighborhood people to represent their interests at the outlet itself. Is that a reasonable expectation? Is part of the argument Latinos, for example, employ in disputes with the news business that diverse staffs get you better coverage of a community? Is it thus justifiable to expect Latino reporters to keep their ears to the ground, know what's up in the neighborhood? And additionally, a job that they weren't hired to do, police their own newsrooms for signs of bias, distortion, and misrepresentation. These are a lot of jobs, and you're probably not even making as much as your white colleagues. If a white guy or gal named Jones is not expected to do all these things, if it's assumed that the arc of his or her curiosity runs to all things happening in a media market, if it is assumed that most nights the lead story will have nothing to do with a fine-grained sociological understanding of your market's ethnic or racial boundaries and histories, well, you can see where I'm going with this. Your colleagues, your employees, have never asked to be hired as an ethnic or racial stereotype to be a guide to all things Chinese, to all things black, to all things Mexican. Yet, at various times and in various contexts, your organization will ask you to be that in some way, and you'll have to have an answer ready. You will have to make a call for yourself about some of these deep questions. Which battles do you fight, and which ones do you leave alone? In dealings with the public, what's important and what's not? A large number of Americans look set to have a hard time with what's happening right now, with the earth shifting right underneath our feet, with the pool of readers, listeners, viewers set to look very different by 2030 and way different by 2040. Compared to how it looks today. A majority of Americans under 18 are not the descendants of European immigrants to the United States. Are our organizations ready for that? Are they thinking about it? Are they asking themselves about it? After I left NPR in 1999 and went to the PBS NewsHour, I was, at that point, a newsroom veteran of 23 years at every level of the business, from copy boy to editor and everything in between. The letters arrived shortly after I did, and with a steady tempo after that, from members of the audience observing that it was a shame that integrity-filled Jim Lehrer, their ideal of an experienced and straight-down-the-middle journalist, had surrendered to the forces of political correctness and made an obvious affirmative action hire. It didn't matter that I had been working for 23 years. It didn't matter that my weekly audience at NPR was as large as the NewsHour's. It didn't matter that the very same month I started at the NewsHour, the New York Times Book Review raved about my book and called me a national resource. You can look it up. It didn't matter that while at NPR I had taken on a show on the verge of cancellation, doubled the carriage and tripled the cume. It didn't matter that I was a co-recipient of 2 DuPont Columbia silver batons, among the highest honors in the business. In the eyes of no small share of the viewing audience, of the supposedly liberal NewsHour viewing audience, I was just an affirmative action hire. There because of what I was, not because of what I knew how to do. Embedded in that assumption is the unease that comes from assuming that there just had to be, a more qualified white man out there who was unfairly denied a spot as a senior correspondent at this prestigious newscast, who I had cheated out of a job by jumping in front of him on the line. More than 20 years later, a lot grayer and somewhat balder, I don't doubt that even now, if I were to take another high-exposure job in this business, there would be some who would accuse my next employer of making an affirmative action hire, of bending over backwards to meet some imagined racial quota. So if you think at some point you outgrow that because of your enhanced resume, body of work, among some Americans, you will never outgrow that. You just got to live with that. At several junctures, while I was at the NewsHour, I got letters of complaint. Letters of complaint about my pronunciation at the anchor desk. As someone who came from network radio, I can tell you that in radio, a lot of stock is placed in saying things correctly. When a new hero or villain or place pops up in the news, somebody would head over to the newsroom whiteboard and put up the pronouncer for a coup leader, a newly elected president, or the place where there had just been a terrible earthquake or a tsunami. So we learned how to say General Wojciech Jaruzelski and Lech Wałęsa and Boko Haram and Fukushima. We learned how to say all these things because it's part of your responsibility. Internally at the NewsHour, I was known for being picky about these things. I would have production assistants call the embassy in Washington to get from the press office the pronunciation for the new prime minister. So it was with some amusement that I noted the letters from people not just observing, but complaining that I pronounced Spanish names of guests, of places, in Spanish, while I didn't do that for any other languages. An odd new form of discrimination. The funny part, the bizarre part was that I was doing it for Russian names and African names. Not only did but it only really stuck in their craw. It only really made them find out our address and sit down and write a letter and buy a stamp and mail the letter to complain about me pronouncing Spanish names. I was in their ears only doing that in a way to irritate them. Now, when I pronounced the name of the Korean UN Secretary General correctly, how did I know how to say his name? I asked him. I said to Ban Ki-moon, Mr. Secretary General, how should I say it? I know how people say it, Ban Ki-moon, but how do you say it? If you were calling a restaurant in Seoul to make a reservation for tonight, how would you introduce yourself on the phone? And he taught me how to say his name, and the next time I was on the air and he was in the news, that's how I said it. And nobody complained because it's not Spanish. It's all part of the tricky dynamic of talking to a changing country where a lot of the residents are unhappy about the changes underway. Every time I covered immigration on NPR or on the NewsHour, people wrote to complain that it was unfair that I covered immigration because it was clearly going to be biased if I was covering immigration. Deeply embedded in their complaints was the assumption, the expectation that someone they perceived as a regular American would be more even-handed, would play fair, and that I wouldn't. The irony is, of course, my own family didn't have to navigate some border or head north from a war-ravaged republic. They got on a plane. Half of them landed in Floyd Bennett Field in Brooklyn on cargo planes, and the other half of them landed at LaGuardia Airport, and then got off and got picked up. That's our immigration saga. It doesn't take long to tell, but there it is. My colleague Gwen Ifill constantly faced similar accusations in covering political races whenever they involved a black politician. Almost every presidential campaign in the history of the country has featured 2 or more presidential candidates facing off in the general election who were always one thing. They were always white men. And who covered them almost always? Other white men. It saved on a lot of paper and stamps, I guess, because, of course, this was all done free of bias and free of any kind of racial prejudice. I don't know how long it will take for us to be a little bit more onto ourselves and self-critical about why some things are as natural as breathing and some things take a lot of getting used to. As I mentioned earlier, the difficulties and challenges do not occur in one direction only. There are community expectations that are as unfair and misguided as any that will originate in your newsroom. When I was working in Los Angeles and Chicago, there were profound problems in Latino communities in both places. And Latino community organizations and their leaders either implied or said to me directly, said to me right out, that they expected me to take it easy on the bad news and spend a little bit more time pumping up the good news, emphasizing the good, demonstrating their own misunderstanding of the very meaning of news itself and why I had my job in the first place and what my job was. There were also expectations of community profile. As activists and organizations judge Latino reporters on their willingness to live a life of service outside of the already extensive hours we worked at our regular jobs. When I was in Chicago, a community leader told me a Mexican colleague of mine who had grown up spending her summers in the fields in California before becoming the first member of her family to finish high school and go on to college. She was whitewash, he told me, because she had decided to live in a lakefront condo instead of the string of Latino neighborhoods that ran northwest and southwest from the Loop. I had to tell that person off, reminding him that one of the fiercest battles minority people fought in the post-war decades was the right to live anywhere where we can afford to live. And now, here he was, judging her because she didn't want to live in Pilsen or Little Village. My colleague was a successful single woman who could afford a lakefront condo, wanted to live close to work, and shouldn't be judged on her identity or her commitment to La Raza based on her zip code. It was bizarre, but there we were, groaning under the weight of expectations placed on us by unexpected quarters. A lot of my discretion over which battles to fight and which ones to ignore were based on long years of agitation and anger over the very real limitations of my own progress in the business, the very sure knowledge that many of my colleagues with inferior bodies of work to mine and significantly less experience were going to be promoted ahead of me. I knew that. I understood it. I internalized it. It was just part of the game. And if I couldn't play, I had to get out of the game. I had to relax. I had to do my own thing to my own satisfaction without driving myself crazy. It has taken a long time for bosses to realize that there's something wrong with the notion that women get to cover women's stories and black people get to cover black people's stories and white men get to cover everything. even in 2022, as the default mode beings of American journalism. They possess an evenness of temper, a disinterestedness, the proper detachment to go anywhere and do anything, because not a lot of people know this. White men possess no biases or prejudgment, which makes them able to cover everything in this manner. There are a lot of wonderful things I've gotten to do in this business. And I've learned a lot and seen a lot and have a career that I couldn't have imagined when I was changing typewriter ribbons at WNEW. But I also know that a lot of opportunities have not been offered because of prejudgment of my abilities, my range, my interests, because of where I'm from, where my family's from, what it's presumed I'm good at. Unlike white colleagues, my good work as a moderator of 2 presidential candidates' debates doesn't lead to another invitation. Anchoring specials on PBS did not lead to other invitations to do similar work. And if a network news division were to hire me today, you could bet I'd be covering issues of wealth and poverty in American cities, immigration and Latino politics, rather than the aftermath of Brexit, the Ukrainian refugee crisis, or civil war in Ethiopia, even though I have a degree in African history and extensive reporting experience in Britain and Western Europe. But I don't worry about any of that. Just so you don't misunderstand me, I'm not angry and I'm not disappointed. I just take this business for being what it is instead of driving myself crazy about what it's not. I asked Rachel if I could share my top 73 tips for a happy life in the business. And she asked me to confine it to 10, so I'll do that. Number 1, modesty is an admirable trait, but not always useful in a news organization. Don't go on and on about how terrific you are, what you can do, and what you've done in other places. Just do it. When necessary, remind people of what you did, but first, before you remind them, give them a chance to remember it on their own. Number 2, don't be a pushover, but don't be a jerk either. Leave that to other people in the newsroom. There are a lot of people who are going to be much better at it than you are. Number 3, share. It is an important part of newsroom chemistry. That is, until it is proven that it's not doing you any good. So be the sharing person, because it often improves stories, it improves coverage, it improves the way the other people are doing the other things that you're not doing. Go ahead and do them. And do it for as long as it works. And when it doesn't work, then hoard. Be on time. Be where you say you're going to be when you say you're going to be there. Do what you say you're going to do, over and over and over and over. Control your temper. Self-control is an underrated virtue. Thank people for compliments and take their criticisms seriously. Don't suffer in silence. This work is going to inevitably involve disappointment, even heartbreak, but it should not involve endless suffering. If there's something wrong, you got to tell somebody, and you've got to locate the person in your organization who is not necessarily the right person on the organizational chart to tell about your suffering, but the person who's the right person to tell about it, who needs to know, who will actually help things change. Remember, you exist in a human ecosystem. Ask yourself, if they were asked, what would my colleagues say about my work and about me? Put yourself forward for hard jobs nobody else wants to do, and keep very good notes of when you did those things, both when you offered and when you actually did those hard jobs that nobody else wants to do. Because while in an ideal world your bosses would be keeping score, you have to backstop them and keep score yourself. And this is the hardest one, which is why I left it for the end. If you take your boss's money, you have to take his or her values. Once you can't take their values, you can't take their money either, and it's time to go somewhere else, where you can take their money and their values. At the same time, always remember, you own you. You're selling your experience and your skill. You are not, I hope, selling yourself. You are constantly adding to the value of the inventory of outlook, experiences, skills, knowledge that stands on the shoulder of knowledge. You own that. If you spend 3 years someplace, you're looking for the door and it's not really great, that place still has value to you as a place where you can take on inventory, experiences, ideas, perspectives, experience. You agree to sell your labor, and you agree to do that without hesitation. Once you find yourself selling that labor to further goals that you don't believe in, that marshal your creative output in the service of values that violate your own, you are breaking the contract with your bosses. But more fundamentally, you're not being true to yourself. Just a little bit at a time, you're surrendering to the nihilism, to the bitterness, to the cynicism that makes so many newsrooms hateful places to be. You know that person in your place. There's one everywhere. I would be shocked if there isn't one where you work. And if you look around, you can't figure it out, maybe it's you. So be careful. Own yourself. Be clear about what you do and why you do it, and you'll be happier in the long run. My own Achilles heel, 46 years since I first walked into a newsroom, is that I still love this. And I really, if it was easier to not love it, it would be easier for me to leave and do something else, or change it up, or get out of the business altogether, or retire, any of those things. But I can't. So I will stick with it for years to come. Sometimes I wish I didn't love it quite so much. It would be easier to walk away. Thank you. I hope I haven't gone on too long. Oh, I used up my whole hour, huh? Sorry.
We definitely wanted to leave some time for questions, Ray, but I wanted to just quickly start by saying he's the embodiment of what my mother used to tell me. It doesn't matter why they gave it to you as long as you keep it because you're good. And it's just, you can tell by the depth of his stories and what the message he's trying to communicate that's true. We want to leave some time for you guys to get to know each other and chat, but are there any burning questions? Are there any comments that... And, oh, that's right. Please. We can also do that, but are there any questions that anyone wants to sort of ask in this setting, in this moment?
Are your books on Amazon?
Yes, they are, and they're all still in print, and they're very good. So.
My name is Brittany Johnson. I'm an investigative reporter with KCRA 3 News in Sacramento, California. My question is, how can we support the journalists in our newsrooms who have been hired to be bilingual reporters? Speaking on behalf of the one bilingual reporter that we have, Maricela de la Cruz, I would like to support her more. She's doing a lot of work where she's taking our scripts in English and translating them to Spanish in addition to doing her own 3 stories a day. So how can we best support her in that?
Make it clear to Maricela that you understand how hard her job is. That actually, it doesn't sound like much, but actually it makes a big difference. If someone, that's a hard job, taking the news that's prepared in one language and repurposing it in another. I know that everybody is pressed and under the gun when they're in the field, but if you are in situations where some of the people you're getting bites from are capable of saying what they have to say in Spanish as well, just roll off another 20 seconds worth of tape and you will have done her a great favor. Because instead of having to run a second voice track of translation, she can run the bite clean. The same one that you're running in your piece, just in another language.
Hi, my name is Laura Duclos. I'm from the Houston Chronicle. I am that person who sometimes does the translations. How do you justify to your editors and to other people in the newsroom that like you are bilingual and that is like an extra service that you're giving your business and that you should be like either paid more or accommodated for more and things like that? It feels that I am in a similar situation where I'll be walking by and somebody's like, hey, what is this? Hey, spend, 2 hours making subtitles and translating this, and I don't know how to tell them that that's not something that everybody can do.
Do you have a periodic review?
I do. I have one coming up soon.
Great. A portion of that review should be spent discussing exactly that.
Perfect.
Not necessarily as the pointy end of the spear on a wage demand, but a shot across their bow that they should be aware that you're providing that extra service, so that when you are asking for other accommodation, there's give. Not everything has to be a quid pro quo, but you have to be sure that they are aware of your value to the operation in a way that's not yucky.
Perfect.
And
Thanks.
it's the way that's not yucky part that's sometimes the hardest, but it's the most essential, really, in that. Because you have to remember their vision of why you're there, your vision of why you're there, and what the gap is between the two. In too many instances, they think they've done you this enormous solid by just giving you a job. Like, how could they think this is unfair? I gave them a job, didn't I? And you're doing the job plus another job that isn't spelled out in your job description. You're just doing it. You got to narrow the two visions of what you think you're there doing and what they think you're there doing.
Hi, I'm Crystal Nurse. I'm from the Lansing State Journal. My question is, for those who are hired as diversity, like in those diversity roles, such as a diversity reporter, the inclusion reporter, or the race reporter, how do you force your newsroom not to look at you as the token and use you as a token when it comes to coverage? Wow,
that's hard because in some instances, depending on management, this is not something that's easily fixable. For some of them, they might as well call it the token news reporter and have that on your business card, given their intention. If they're doing it as a defensive move to keep the newsroom out of trouble and to be able to say to the wider community, hey, look, we hired a race, diversity, and inclusion reporter. If they understand what that reporter is there for, and have a fully formed idea of what the gap was in their coverage before and how they closed it or conceded they needed to close it, and that's why they hired this person, that's the ideal. But in too many cases, they're going to think, I got beat up by corporate, I got managers breathing down my neck, I got advertisers breathing down my neck, so we had to turn around and hire this person with this job title. So they think of it as something that they were reluctantly forced to do, and something that's detracting from their ability to deploy the workforce in an ideal way. Oh, I got this race, diversity, and inclusion reporter that I can only give those assignments. I can't send them to do. The answer there at the risk of saying the obvious, the first answer, of course, is to do great stories, which prove the value of having the beat in the first place. But let's assume that that's a given. The other flex is to find aspects of the stories that are the lead stories in that market and find the race, diversity, and inclusion angle that nobody is talking about, thinking about, or discussing as part of that story, and saying, here's how that's heard where I'm from. Here's how that story is processed in this neighborhood. Then they look at that and say, A, this is something we never would have thought of, and B, this enhances the coverage of the big story, that's the front page story, with this really sharp sidebar that actually isn't stuck on like an applique, but actually opens up and enhances the idea that we want to give to our coverage area that we are on this story. Yes, we're on the most obvious lead story angle that starts on 1A, but we're also thinking about it in deeper ways, and that's why you buy the newspaper at all. You've got to make that a value-added proposition for them, or else they're always going to feel it's being something they're forced to do by political correctness or blah, 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 whatever bullshit they're going to say about why they had to add that job. There's a lot of value in having that job. You just got to mine it.
As one OG reporter to another, Ray, it has been a privilege and an honor
Thanks a lot.
to hear you speak
Thanks for asking me to
tonight.
come.
I would like to ask us all to give him